Good evening. I'm Kevin Robbins of the University of Chicago Humanities Division. Thank you for joining us and welcome to tonight's Dean Salon, The Promise of Freedom, Voting and Community in the United States, 1789 to the present. And with that, I'd like to introduce the host of our event tonight, Dean Ann Walters Robertson of the Division of the Humanities.
I'm Ann Walters Robertson, Dean of the Humanities at the University of Chicago. Although I wish we were gathered in person for this event, I'm delighted to see so many of you are here with us virtually, and am happy the Zoom format lets us enjoy the company of many guests from beyond Chicago. I have the honor of introducing our speakers today, but first, let me share a brief overview of the evening's program. Kathleen Belew and Eric Slauter will engage in a conversation about how the American community has been defined in different ways throughout our history, examining how those definitions have had consequences for who is able to vote and who is not. After their conversation, they will answer questions from you. Kathleen and Eric are looking forward to your thoughts, so please feel free to ask questions throughout the conversation using the Q&A function in Zoom. Lastly, I will close the event with some final remarks. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to this evening's speakers, Kathleen Belew and Eric Slauter. Kathleen Belew is Assistant Professor of U.S. History and the college. She specializes in the recent history of the United States, examining the long aftermath of warfare. Her first book, entitled Bring the War Home, Paramilitary America, the White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, explores how white power activists wrought a cohesive social movement through a common story about warfare and its weapons, uniforms, and technologies, and carried out escalating acts of violence that reached a crescendo in the 1995 bombing of Oklahoma City. She is a frequent commentator in the media. You may have seen her op-ed on the white power movement in the New York Times last week. Eric Slauter is Associate Professor of English and Deputy Dean of the Humanities Division. A historian of American thought and culture, Slaughter's scholarship focuses chiefly on the period between the American Revolution and the Civil War. His first book, The State as a Work of Art, The Cultural Origins of the Constitution, examined the relation of culture to politics in revolutionary America. Eric is also the director of the Carla Shearer Center for the Study of American Culture. Now, the Carla Shearer Center is one of the jewels of the Humanities Division. It has been instrumental in elevating our work in American history and culture, and I would like to say a few words tonight about it. The center was established in 2008 thanks to a very generous gift by Carla Shearer, who is here with us this evening. As a result of this commitment, the Shearer Center has created a forum for the multidisciplinary study of American history and culture. And thanks to the Shearer Center, the University of Chicago approaches the study of American culture in a way that goes well beyond the literary and historical studies that are the core of most American studies programs. The center convenes faculty and students pursuing advanced projects on American culture from across the university, incorporating insights from a range of departments in the Division of the Humanities and Social Sciences, as well as the Divinity School, Chicago Booth, the Law School, and the Harris School of Public Policy. Through the Shearer Center, we've been able to extend our reach beyond Hyde Park campus and partner with institutions in Chicago to advance understanding of American history and culture. The Shearer Center's partnership with the Newberry Library is a model of the university's commitment to collaboration and intellectual impact. In 2011, the two organizations planned a major international conference on the American Revolution that was described at the time as the largest gathering of experts on the American Revolution since the Revolution. The Chicago Conference on the American Revolution brought together scholars from multiple disciplines, including history, law, political science, literature, anthropology, and art history, to examine the revolution at a time when it had become newly relevant within the United States and abroad. This conference had a major impact on the way the revolution is studied and resulted in the publication of the Oxford Handbook of the American Revolution, published by Oxford University Press in 2012. Since then, the Center has continued to partner with the Newberry Library on the Newberry Seminar in American Art and Visual Culture, the Newberry Seminar on Gender and Sexuality, and the Newberry Seminar in Labor History. Events like this evening simply would not have been possible without Carla Shearer's vision and generosity and her confidence in the work this university does. Thank you so much, Carla. And now I will hand the floor over to Kathleen and Eric for this evening's conversation on voting and community in the United States.
Thank you so much, Dean Robertson, for that beautiful welcome, and welcome to all of you. I'm excited to be discussing this topic with Eric tonight.
Yes, and thank you, Dean Robertson, and good evening. I'm also just tremendously excited to have the chance to speak with Kathleen about matters that are of concern, I think, to all Americans right now, especially. We have about 35 minutes for our conversation, and we've decided to split it up into sort of three chunks, just like the Constitution, three separate parts. Our first will really focus on the history of the present and the last few weeks. The second will jump back to the founding era and move into the 19th century. And then finally, we'll take another jump into the mid-20th century and look at some documents from the moment of the civil rights movement through the early 21st century. So, and I also do want to second Dean Robertson's thanks to Carla Shearer, who has made just an enormous amount possible on our campus, helping to bring scholars from different departments together and to work to train students together. It's really just a wonderful thing that was not possible in the days before the center. So Kathleen, one thing I've always been interested in about the courses that you teach is that you teach a course on the history of the present, which is a concept that perhaps not everyone will self-evidently understand. But we're living in a quite extraordinary time, so I thought we'd just start in the present. And we could start just with today's news and the rather shocking developments reported by the FBI out of Michigan about the militia plot to abduct Governor Gretchen Whitmer. This is extraordinary news, and I know that given your expertise, you're probably the perfect person to speak with about this. I'm wondering, I know it's an election issue, it's related to the election, but is it related to voting in community, and how do you, as a historian, think about an episode like the one that's unfolding today?
Thank you so much for that question. I think I'm going to break this into two different parts. One is about what we mean when we say history of the present, because I think that one of the things I try to have students walk away from that class with is simply a skill set for encountering what I think many of us experience as just a torrent of news all the time. We're flooded. This cycle just goes on and on and on. It's more than anybody can follow or take or emotionally process before there's another story. And that was before the pandemic. So now we have this extra warp speed thing happening. So history of the present can be a sort of Foucauldian project around creating a genealogy, a map of how we got from there to here, an understanding of the systems we find ourselves in. But it can also be a way of creating other ideas of what might be possible, other ideas of what historians would call contingency, the road not taken. So that's what I mean by history of the present. This episode with the militia members abducting a sitting governor and some strong hints that they may have been interested in doing violence to her after that abduction. Certainly they were apprehended with explosives planning and other kind of evidence that this was a very serious threat. This one is part of a broader groundswell that we actually have to use history to understand, because what we see in the moment are a bunch of disconnected stories. In the present moment, what we're seeing is reporting around a lone wolf attack here or there, reporting around the Boogaloo Boys, reporting around the Proud Boys, the militia movement, but those are all sometimes understood as separate stories. What the history shows us is that this is all part of the same phenomenon, that this is part of a broad and flexible social movement that has been active in the United States since the late 1970s and poses an imminent threat to our democracy, especially to our elections and to peaceful transfer of power. The people who attacked, or I suppose targeted, the governor of Michigan were partly fixated on her as a target because of her insistence on masking, social distancing, and other quarantine measures, but are also deeply affiliated with militia and white power ideology.
Yeah, and even in the last hours, the acting attorney general responsible for national security has released an op-ed in the New York Times to explain that the Second Amendment doesn't cover these kinds of militias. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yes. Oh, that's such a good one for a conversation tonight. Yes. There's been a pushback just in the last few weeks about the use of the word militia as if there is a good and lawful militia. And certainly there are good and lawful National Guard units, but the amendments, the Second Amendment militias, the ones enumerated in the Constitution, were all incorporated into the National Guard in the early 20th century. So what I'm talking about when I say militia are entirely extra-legal groups. These are paramilitary groups operating completely outside of the law. There is no, I'm not trying to imbue any kind of validation on them by using the word militia. I think that pushback might be coming from National Guard units where that word still denotes military service, but the people that are doing this kind of activism are not in any way acting in service of the state. And in fact, what I found in my research of these groups in the 1980s and 90s is that they have been involved in attempts to overthrow the federal government for several decades. So it's not at all the Second Amendment of militia. I mean, they will claim the Second Amendment and they will claim popular sovereignty and they'll claim other kind of vestiges of Americanness, even as they are waging war against the state. But I mean, I really, I can't underscore enough that, the impact on voting here is going to be not around neutral law and order or poll watching or something. The impact is going to be voter intimidation and very likely mass casualty attacks.
Yeah. When we spoke last week on, I guess it was October 1st, this was the cover of the New York Times, which explains that baseless attacks are threatening the process of elections that have been in place since 1788. It was that evening probably that you were working on and publishing an op-ed yourself in the New York Times that I would direct our viewers to, which is called "Why Stand Back and Stand By Should Set Off Alarm Bells." I know you had quite a sort of media week last week, appearing with Anderson Cooper and Rachel Maddow and publishing this piece in the New York Times and doing events elsewhere. What really struck me about the op-ed wasn't that it was written with such a great delicacy about the history of the movement here, but that it revealed that the debate itself had presented something new to you. In other words, that something that in years of researching the white power movement had not really dawned on you. And you called that a war on American democracy. And I'd love to just have you elaborate a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been talking with our colleague Jim Sparrow about this since the book was in manuscript form. And I'm not sure it ever really became clear to me until that moment in the debate how much this has become about marshaling the white power movement specifically to do damage to the voting process, to the fair transfer of power, and to, I mean, to democratic institutions. It's a really interesting moment because during the period of my study, which is the post-Vietnam War to the Oklahoma City bombing, during that period, these activists didn't think government had anything to offer them. They didn't think that they could get anywhere with voting. They were not interested in democracy anymore. And in fact, the last time they became very violent in the way that we're seeing today was not under a leftist administration, but it was under the Reagan years. And the reason was that they thought Reagan was too moderate and could never deliver the kinds of changes they wanted. And to be sure, they wanted very extreme things. They talked about things like return to slavery or establishment of new Jim Crow or apartheid systems or white homelands. None of that was going to happen through peaceful voting and the sort of traditional democratic pathways. So instead, these activists took up weapons and started a kind of guerrilla warfare campaign to unseat the federal government. Now, today, we have a very different kind of state that we're encountering in a lot of ways, or at least a very different kind of administration. And this week, Trump's own Department of Homeland Security finally put out this report that was supposed to come out last spring about the new threat assessment to the homeland. And this report reveals that not only is domestic terror now, the main source of domestic terror is now not Antifa and the left, not Islamist extremism, but white power groups and affiliated activists. Not only are they now the largest terrorist threat to the nation, but they are now more violent than at any point since the Oklahoma City bombing. 2019 was like the biggest year for fatalities since the Oklahoma City bombing. That is incredible because there wasn't a single event, right? We're talking about a tide of events. We're talking about a rising tide of momentum. And I think it's much more concerning. And the extent to which the Trump administration, even in the most generous interpretation, if he meant to say stand down to the Proud Boys, they heard that as a call to preparedness. And it's not clear to anybody that he has the power to stand them down after that. It's not clear to anybody that he can call them off.
I mean, this was also a question of today's news in the injunction to liberate Michigan.
Yeah.
But I'm sort of curious, maybe as a bridge across 2 centuries. Yeah. Something we've never talked about is just the sense of history within the white power movement. I know that it has its own, its own sort of historiography internal to it, to itself, and then it of course has an external historiography which it can sometimes mobilize. But what is the sense within the movement of the place of the founding documents?
That's such a great question. So part of the reason that this is complex is that this is a movement that is in every way but race, a very diverse movement. It incorporates a bunch of different kinds of ideologies, different founding narratives, different cultures. So if you think about something like if we go mid-'80s, which is where I have the clearest picture because we have the archival base to talk about it. If you think about the kind of mental gymnastics required to bring like a conservative Christian identity housewife together with like a urban skinhead who goes topless and wears all kinds of eyeliner and shaves their head, right? Like those people came together into one movement. This is across the country, all different regions, rural, urban, and suburban space, across educational background, across class, across gender, across age group. They were able to do that through this very intense call of whiteness and a set of issues around it. But significantly within the movement, there's a lot of disagreement about how to interpret history. And I'm not sure that anybody but me and Eric are going to be quite as excited about this conversation. But I think it's super interesting. So for instance, there's a big group of people in the South who descend from kind of anti-civil rights era Klan organizing. And for them, the Civil War is absolutely the most important thing that's ever happened. They think that they were wronged. They have a lost cause narrative of American history. And they're still looking for a Confederate States of America often. Then in the West, there's a thing called posse comitatus, which agrees with some parts of being American, but they think that any law enforcement or federal or governmental oversight above the level of a local sheriff is corrupt. So they're going to follow the law, they're going to follow the Constitution, but anything made above that level, they won't accept. So no federal government, no state legislature, no anything bigger than your local community. And they're quite violent about not accepting the rest of it. And then there are people who are income tax resistors who really like the founding documents to a point, but not the part about taxation. There are people who are, and the other weird one is they really love American Indians and Native communities. Love. They see them as being in the correct place on the correct terrain. They think the reservation system is kind of a good model for how a white homeland could work. So they really, in this archive that's full of just racist invective everywhere, how they speak about Native communities is like notably different. It's really interesting. So with that, I will turn now to ask Eric some questions about those founding documents. And we thought that maybe this would be a good opportunity to do a little history of the present for the group, such that we can sort of decode some of the moment in which we find ourselves using the tools that we get from the historical archive. So we thought we'd start with just what exactly is voting and representation at the moment of the founding? How do people think about the act of voting and who is included in the polity right at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that made me laugh about that New York Times headline last week about, the integrity of a process in place in 1788, it would be hard to point to the election of 1788 as one of, absolutely, or any of the early American elections, as one of great inclusivity or lack of fraudulence or anything like that. I think the best estimates right now are that about 6% of the population was able to vote for electors in 1788 and 1789. There's a wonderful digital humanities project called the New Nation Votes, which really compiles all of this data. But I think many viewers will know that voting in the constitutional sense, in the text of the Constitution, uses the word qualifications for voters, and it really this is an age where there isn't a right to vote. It's really imagined as a privilege to vote, and in fact, it's not until the 14th Amendment in 1868 that you get a phrase like the right to vote, which you see repeated in the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, in the amendment about 18-year-olds and so forth. It becomes a real term of constitutional art, but it's not a term that really exists in the 1770s and 1780s, when we're talking about a very small group of white landholders who are eligible to vote. I think the saving grace here is always comparison. The number of people who could vote of those white males who held property was in fact larger than in other contemporary nation states, such as Britain. At times there was perhaps 75% of the electorate that could hold land, just because of the sort of abundance of land in the early United States. But certainly certain groups, many women, though not all, were learning all sorts of new things about the fact that the New Jersey Constitution did not disenfranchise women. It just sort of was silent on the question of who was eligible to vote merely on the basis of property. Married women, it seems, were not able to vote. They were covered by their husbands under the doctrine of legal coverture. But some widows did vote, and within the last year or two, the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia has uncovered some evidence of women in voter rolls in New Jersey in the 18th and early 19th century, which is a sort of extraordinary finding, and really a testament to great archival digging for something that we thought might have happened but weren't quite sure. I do think, it's worth, I'm sitting in front of a copy of the Declaration of Independence. It's debate season, and as you probably saw on the debate last night, the debate last week, and really since 2008, the Declaration has always appeared on the debate stage behind the candidates, the sort of famous second paragraph that outlines the inalienable rights and the right to alter and reform governments, and the idea that government is based on the consent of the governed. So I think that is one of the great sort of takeaways from the revolutionary period. The Declaration, which is one of the documents I chose to put in our box folder, is not a document that has a lot to say about voting beyond the question of the idea that all governments, no matter what form they are based on consent. But it does, in the section that almost no one reads, but was actually the most important sections to contemporaries because it laid out the case against the British monarch. George III is held to task for having his proxies, the royal governors in various states like Massachusetts and elsewhere, dissolve the representative assemblies and not allow others to be reelected, which was a charge that would have resonated for people in the 18th century because it harkened back to the moment of the Glorious Revolution in the late 17th century, the days of Locke and William and Mary and James II. But yes, I mean, it's not a document that says an enormous amount about voting, but it is, I think, it is there, and we can learn a little bit about it from a document like that.
Yeah, well, and certainly it lays out some of the promises that I think we're all thinking about when we think about what enfranchisement can mean. So
Exactly.
one of the things that
advocates for women's suffrage often just drew directly from this. We know, for instance, that the delegates at the Seneca Falls Convention looked to the format of the Declaration in order to make their case for women's rights and controversially even for women's suffrage. But you'll see lots of photographs of women with banners, even standing outside of the White House that just read "consent of the governed." A phrase that just goes back to 1776.
So one of the things that I want to ask you before we, move on too far from the founding moment is one of the things that people point to when we talk about voting disparity, voting process, disenfranchisement, is the continual presence in our democracy of the Electoral College. Often this is presented as a thing we have always been invested in and stuck with, or it's a holdover, kind of a neutral holdover from another time. But do you want to tell us a little bit about the construction of the Electoral College, but also that idea of it being part of the plan?
Yeah, I mean, it is a sort of extraordinary fact that, strictly speaking, Americans cannot vote directly for their nation's highest elective office. I think one needs to sort of step back and think about the nature of representation just within the Constitution itself. Article 1 and Article 2 are not very balanced, despite the sort of separation of powers and checks and balances. Article 1 is a very long article dealing with the very complex issues of how to apportion representation within the House of Representatives and who should be responsible for appointing, in this case, senators. It was the state legislatures until the amendments in the amendment in 1913. Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I always tell people that they should do if they find themselves in the National Archives is to go look at the signed parchment copy of the Declaration and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And the Constitution is most remarkable, I think, because it was engrossed on parchment by September 17th, 1787, in time for the delegates to vote on it. And at that last meeting that they held before they actually voted and signed their approval of the document, a motion was made to change the minimal ratio of representatives to electors from 1 in 40,000, which sounded alarmingly high. We would only have one representative for every 40,000 Americans, to 1 in 30,000. And in fact, this was the only time that George Washington ever spoke at the Constitutional Convention. He was the president of the convention. He presided, but presidents were meant to guide, just as speakers of the House are meant to. They guide the debate, but they don't enter into it. And certainly Washington tried to stay above the fray, but he approved this particular change. And the scribe Jacob Chalice, you can see on the manuscript, has actually erased 40 and put in 30. So I think of that as the sort of first amendment. But the question of Article 2, I mean, I think this is one of the very strange phenomenons. And Alex Kaiser at Harvard Kennedy School has written a wonderful book that came out this past summer called "Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?" And it's not a partisan study. It's really designed to walk you through the history. And what he finds is that something like 200 proposals have been introduced into Congress to change the Electoral College since the early 19th century. And in fact, he estimates that it's the most popular thing to try to change about the Constitution. And some are trying to change the nature of the body itself, get rid of an electoral college, a term which in fact is not in the Constitution, and replace it with a national public vote. Others simply want to reform the ways in which states actually apportion their electors and to get away from the winner-take-all category and make it more proportional. But yes, I mean, I think, it needs to be seen within the context of a series of trade-offs in the Philadelphia Convention. I could sort of talk your ear off about this, but there were basically three proposals. One, to have the president elected by the national legislature, by the Congress, for a term of 7 years. There were obvious problems with this. And so slowly they moved it into the Senate. So the Senate might elect the president for a shorter term, but then the Senate becomes, the president becomes a creature of the Senate, which is supposed to advise and consent on various measures. So another proposal was to create another body like Congress, about exactly the same size, and that's what the Electoral College in effect is. It's the size of the number of members of Congress and Senate, and to have them mediate this vote within the states. I think they thought it would be a much more deliberative activity. I don't think they foresaw that people would be pledged to certain names and so forth. I don't think they predicted the growth of it in quite the way it has taken root in various states, with the exception, I think, of Maine and Nebraska. The third proposal, which really came out of Pennsylvania, was for a direct national vote. And Pennsylvania was the most democratic of the early state constitutions. It didn't even have a Senate. It just had a single General Assembly. It didn't have a governor. It had a Supreme Executive Council made up of several people. And the person who sat at the head of that, who at the time of the convention was Benjamin Franklin, was known as the president of Pennsylvania, but it was a fairly weak office. And so only Pennsylvania approved this, measure. But what Kaiser finds is that, ever since they've started taking opinion polls about this right after World War II, most Americans polled would prefer to do away with the Electoral College and replace it with a national popular vote.
Yeah. So in those days, at the beginning, when Americans went to vote, when white property owning American men went to vote, how was that? How did they prove that they owned property? How did they vote? How did it work?
The mechanics are a little difficult to determine. Sometimes there was a sort of a list of people who had paid taxes, and you could sort of sync up with that. Other times it was basically on oath or affirmation that you had done such things. What we know is that the government didn't certainly print ballots. The word ballot derives from the Italian word for ball, which was you would place a ball into a jar to indicate that you were voting. And we sort of have adopted this, since the early 19th century to mean the paper ticket. But certainly a lot of people voted not secretly, they voted by voice in this period, or they voted with printed paper slips that clearly indicated, sometimes with a color scheme, which party they were voting for, and with a whole list of people. And it was the parties themselves that printed these or had them printed in newspapers, and people would just deposit them into the ballot box. So, but there are still cases of people voting with corn or beans or any other sort of round thing, into the 19th century. And wow. I think, at least one state retained, I think Kentucky retained a voice vote well into the late 19th century.
Why round? Is it just about putting it into a jar?
I'm not sure. But I mean, you can sort of, I'm no etymologist and I don't speak Italian, but you can sort of hear the word ball in it.
Yeah, and okay. So tell us about the document from the 1840s one, the New York one.
Yeah, and I want to move so that we get some time into the 20th century too, but I did put into our box folder 2 examples of the way that during the early 19th century, which is a period when historians really think of as a moment where a lot of property qualifications were dismantled, the vote became extended to far more white men than it ever had. And that's generally the story we tell. And then there are reversals, after the Civil War, 100 years of Jim Crow obstruction of the vote. But a document like the one I have right here, this is a document that I love to pass around to students. It's a copy of what was called a freedom certificate or certificate of freedom that the New York State legislature required all black voters, all free black voters in the 1810s to obtain at their own expense, at the expense of the black voters. And they did this really only for partisan reasons. The Democratic Republicans controlled the New York State legislature, and they worried that black voters were most sympathetic to the Federalist Party, which was the party dedicated to emancipation. And no emancipation law had yet passed in New York until 1817. But this is a document from 1816. It's a blank document that would have been filled out by a county clerk or a judge or a mayor in order to certify that a particular black person could prove that he was free. The document is cast with he's in the male gender. That he owned enough property or rented a property that was worth 40 shillings, so that he met the requirement. And also that that he had paid taxes within the last year, because voting and taxing were always sort of linked, as they are, of course, in the Declaration. But yes, it's a rather extraordinary document. And I have to say, the person who has done the most work on this is one of the students from the SHARE seminar way back when, in our first year in 2008, named Sarah Groningsater, who is now an assistant professor of American history at the University of Pennsylvania, and who 2 years ago published a really remarkable article in which she looked at the surviving 244 filled out certificates of freedom, and began to not just speculate, but really come to some deep conclusions that Blacks had in fact affected votes in a number of places, not necessarily in New York City, but in a number of rural places where their votes were weighty enough to matter.
That's so cool. That's an amazing research story, and I want to hear all about her archives and her process and everything. So,
yeah. Maybe we should move. I have this literacy document, but in many ways it speaks to the first document that you chose. So it's a document from the 1850s, and it turns out to be the very first literacy test in the United States, which was passed really against Irish Catholics, the migration of Irish people to New England in the 1850s. The rise of the nativist Know Nothing Party brought about these two constitutional amendments that required people to be able to read, in the case of Connecticut, the state constitution, and in the case of Massachusetts, to be able to read and write their name. And I think that's a thing, an aspect of voter exclusion that we don't think of as happening to white people in the 19th century, but it certainly did. It was certainly very prevalent, and it sort of anticipated really a century of such activities. So I wondered if, maybe as a transition, we could talk about that Louisiana voter registration test that you provided us with. How would you teach such a document? I have to say, even as an expert, I couldn't pass all the questions.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of the lesson of those documents, is like the literacy tests and citizenship tests are often really great for teaching undergraduates, because the bar for enfranchisement is so high for people who are not already included once we enter the 20th century. And I think this is true for people having to pass a citizenship examination, and also for people who are trying to get the vote in the Jim Crow South. Some of the tests are rumored to be a lot worse than the one that we found, but I've been a little picky about trying to get an original document primary source, because I do sometimes think it's been inflated for various reasons. But as you'll see from the one that's posted, it asks very nuanced questions about the workings of the government, and not sort of common knowledge, how does the vote work questions. I would think that most high schoolers would not pass that test today. And I would even think that like many historians in our department would struggle with parts of it today. So it's clearly meant to be a bar to voting. And I mean, we have colleagues like Jane Daly, who's done work about how not only is it an incredibly difficult test, but that the test was administered differently for Black and white people trying to register to vote. So a white person registering would get a test like write your name and the president, and a Black person registering would get these complex civics questions about how Congress controls, what was the one you were saying about international commerce is on one of them.
Right.
So I think like the 20th century story, and I should just flag that Eric and I decided, because he specializes in early America and I specialize in the recent past, and neither of us really specializes in the post-Civil War moment when we have this huge expansion of rights and enfranchisement through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But you have this amazing Share Center programming coming up where you're going to hear from people who are specialists. So we're skipping that for you for today, but it is coming. So come back and hear Eric Follner and Tom Holt and Jeff Stone and who's the other person?
And Jack Rakov.
Oh
and
yeah, Jack Rakov. Come
a
to talk
special
about
session. Yeah, 2 Pulitzer Prize winners in 2 weeks, and a session with 3 wonderful historians and political scientists about the 4 amendments that preceded women's suffrage in
exactly. So come hear about all of that on those days. But so teaching undergraduates the 20th century, the big question is always about, are you going to teach a progress narrative of American history that sort of goes, things are very bad at the beginning of the 20th century. There's a lot of poverty and a lot of inequality and very little labor regulation. And there's, you know, a lot of anti-women movement and a lot of Klan movement and a lot of things like this. And then you go farther and farther into the 20th century, and people really used to want it to be all better after the civil rights movement. My undergraduates used to be very comfortable with all of that at the beginning of the 20th century. But as you get past the civil rights movement and still have persistent inequality, still have barriers to voting, still have various issues with race and other kinds of problems, that was harder for students to figure out. I'm not sure that they're walking around with that progress narrative anymore. But this set of documents is a really good example of how that progress narrative worked. And I think it's still important to understand, because that narrative itself is one of the major shaping forces that delivers us to our current political moment. So what I see through these documents is sort of, we have the citizenship test that sort of shows how bad it was under in the Jim Crow South if you're trying to register to vote as an African American. Then we see the Voting Rights Act, which is this huge expansion of legal access to the right to vote. And then, of course, we see the Supreme Court decision about repealing the Voting Rights Act in 2013, and the rationale is sort of like, this has been addressed, we're finished with it. And that was sort of part of this moment when many people on the right and the left were deeply invested with the idea that we as a nation had moved beyond racism. You know, on the left, we hear about Obama as the post-racial moment. We heard about, you know, like multicultural America. On the right, we had colorblind conservatism, and enormous numbers of people were deeply, deeply invested. I'm not sure there are that many people who would make that argument after seeing the first term of the Trump administration, the rally in Charlottesville, the kind of roaring back into political mainstream of overt racist activism that we've seen in the last several years. But I think that the establishment of that narrative and sort of the arc of that story is a really important thing to understand.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think, you know, this was the first time I had really read the Shelby County versus Holder decision that is so consequential for the implementation of the Voting Rights Act. And really, it does come down to a kind of debate over how to understand the last 40 or 50 years, with the majority, including Roberts and Thomas, Justices Roberts and Thomas, really feeling like an enormous amount of progress, measurable progress had been made in the, you know, that it wasn't, you know, there's a quote that it's not 1964 anymore in those decisions. And then Justice Ginsburg replying that, you know, the majority has sort of given up on the idea that the past is prologue. She actually quotes the phrase from The Tempest, which is on the building, on the outside exterior of the National Archives, the past is prologue. But goes on to say, you know, not only is this a matter of history and memory to people who are still alive, but that there is, and nobody disputes the fact, everyone in the court agrees, that voting restrictions and curtailments are happening right now. Discriminatory practices right now. That's not at issue, and I think that's wonderfully underscored by that document. But we could talk about this for a long time, and I think we probably will at some other venture. But this would be a good time to bring Kevin back and to take some questions from the audience.
Well, thank you, Kathleen and Eric, for that thought-provoking conversation. We do have a number of great questions from our audience, and I would like to start with this one. The first concerns, I think, a remark that you made at the opening about the Constitution having 3 parts. Could you tell us what those are and why it's useful to consider it as composed of 3 parts?
Well, I think, I was sort of joking a little bit about, what is it? Gaul is in 3 parts. It's the beginning of Caesar's commentaries. The Constitution is not necessarily in 3 parts, but I do think, my children certainly learned in their civics and U.S. history classes that, there's a fundamental division between legislative, executive, and judicial power. I think, you can tell with any 18th century document what is hardest to do based on how many words are needed. And so, the Article 1 is, deals with representation and legislation. I think without a doubt, it was the hardest thing for them to work on. Article 2 concerned, an issue that was very fraught, which was, how strong should executive power be in a country that had committed itself through documents like the Declaration to being fundamentally in favor of representation over execution. And then finally, if you look, I mean, the very debate yesterday about, packing the court versus stacking the court, belies the fact that very little is specified about the judiciary in the original Constitution, and much of it, has to be built, like the executive offices have to be built during that first legislative session, the first Congress in 1789. So, I mean, those are the 3 that I chiefly am thinking about. There are questions on that Louisiana tests that indicate that was something you had to know in Louisiana in 1963.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question concerns the concept of citizenship as a requirement for voting. When does that get introduced and accepted as a cornerstone of voting rights? And can you talk about the history of non-citizen voting?
Eric, do you know about that?
I can take the early part of this. I mean, the Constitution and voting, it's an interesting issue because the delegates to the Constitutional Convention couldn't come to a kind of agreement about what, if any, what if any property qualification there might be, or residency requirement there might be for voting in a particular state for a representative who was going to serve in Congress. So they basically kicked that back to the states, saying that the states would be responsible, and that people who could vote for the largest house within a state would also be able to vote for members of the first branch of the national legislature. That varied from state to state, and in some states, people, depending on their property holding, could vote for that, but not for the next highest house, for the Senate or the upper house. But the question of citizenship doesn't really enter the constitutional text until 1868 with the 14th Amendment. And that's exactly the moment when the right to vote also, as a phrase, enters the sort of constitutional vocabulary. There's no definition of citizenship in the Constitution really before 1868. And though it remains a sort of controversial one, and certainly people debate the question of birthright citizenship and so forth, that seems to be the intention of that particular text. But what we know is that, throughout the 19th century, there were places like Wisconsin that, allowed people who had declared their intention to become citizens to vote, which is a rather extraordinary thing. People who had not yet been naturalized, but had declared their intention. I think there was, a sense that of trying to get get out of as many hurdles as possible, particularly in very unpopulated states. So you see that much more on the frontier. In the Northeast, you see a lot of anti-immigration legislation around voting, designed to keep what some are saying is really just ignorant voters, uneducated voters from voting, but which is actually designed as a mechanism to preclude the votes of people of a certain class or people of a certain European background.
I don't have a lot to add to that answer. Eric is so wonderfully eloquent about all of this. I didn't know all that about Wisconsin. I would just add, Martha Jones has a new book out called Birthright Citizenship that's excellent. And there's some exciting new work coming from Catherine Ramirez out of UC Santa Cruz about the idea of denizenship, thinking about what America looks like if we look not just at citizens, but about the entire block of people who are in fact in residence full-time as the parameter. And I think part of her work is going to end up talking about voting and kind of activist efforts around expanding voting.
Yeah, I have a document here that I also like to pass around to classes from the 1850s, written by a lawyer in Chicago who was trying to convince people in New England to lower the residency requirement from 14 years, which was what was proposed for new citizens, that once they got their citizenship, they would have to wait 14 years before they were allowed to vote, down to 2 years. And so he's kind of using statistics, Edward Pierce is, to try to make the case that, as it says, reasons for proposing a residence of 2 years after naturalization instead of 14 years in the United States before foreigners can acquire the right to vote and hold office. But it's right from that moment in 1857 when all sorts of restrictions are beginning to be applied to immigrants on the East Coast that are not being applied in the Midwest.
I want to jump through the screen and look at all of Eric's documents. I haven't gotten to look at documents since March.
So Kathleen, our next question, I'd like to start with you on this, since I think it relates to some of what you were describing and your experiences of teaching 20th century history to undergraduates, even though the question's a little bit more focused on the Constitution and the Declaration. We have a question from the audience member who says that her personal understanding suggests that the Constitution and the Declaration are pretty rooted in white supremacy. For example, the Constitution protects the slave trade, and the Declaration seems to suggest that perhaps the inalienable rights it discusses are for white men of European origins, and refers to Native Americans as savages. Can you talk about the ways in which white supremacy might be rooted in our founding documents and what ramifications that has today?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's important to understand in that question is that racism and whiteness, as we understand them today, were both dramatically not exactly they've changed over time. Both of those categories have changed over time quite a lot. So racism as we understand it today and whiteness as we understand it today both would have looked a lot different in the moment of the nation's founding. And Eric can speak more to this than I can, I'm sure. So some of the things that are recognizable to us as having what we would now call racist connotations, or perhaps louder than a connotation, like the formation of whiteness through anti-Indian violence, like, as you say, the promotion and continuation of slavery. The 3/5 clause, of course, is a very, it's a white supremacist law. That is there, but it's not simple. It's not as simple as saying that they are white supremacist documents, because both of those words are different now than they were at the founding. Does that make sense? So there's a through line, but I think that the thing that history can really help with is to understand how race and whiteness are historically changing and socially constructed categories that really dramatically change, especially over kind of the moment of pseudoscience and scientific racism in the 1800s, and then through the incorporation of different ethnic groups in the early 20th century. We have like a very different kind of whiteness today than we did then. That said, I think that, like, you know, a lot of what we're seeing when we have fights over how we teach history, and this is not new, it's in the news right now because of the president's commission on how we should think about the founding moment, because of the 1776 project, the 1619 project. But this has been a bread and butter issue for conservative organizing for, well, I don't know, at least since the early 20th century. Maybe Eric knows that it's longer than that. But the telling of history such that we are able to deliver a rosy picture of the United States that has no racist thinking anywhere, no white supremacy anywhere, that is not a neutral depiction. That's not the old version. That was always a political project by conservative organizing and through conservative groups. There's a great book about this called Mothers of Massive Resistance that just came out recently that I highly recommend, by Elizabeth McRae, that shows that she looks at segregationist women in the South, and she shows that at every moment they were trying to get into school curricula to change the way that people thought about history and to make it, I mean, what they would have called more patriotic, by making it show Reconstruction more positive, or resistance to Reconstruction more positively, and then Jim Crow more positively. And that's the same thread that we see now. So all of that is just to say that, I mean, one of the things Eric and I talked about when we created this discussion is that, to us, it's not unpatriotic. It's not an unpatriotic thing to understand the friction at the heart of the American project, right? There's this fundamental tension between the radical promises around life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, right? What a radical thing to promise your citizens. And then the fight to expand that promise to include more people. And I think that what we're calling attention to here, and I think we both do this in our teaching, is that that process has not been about generosity and largesse. It's been about activism and organizing, and it's been fraught, right? We see expansion, and then we see contraction. We see resistance, sometimes violent resistance, to the extension of the franchise. But I think, you know, I mean, my interest in this comes from a kind of I guess, a personal conviction that that radical promise is kind of a special thing and worth our study and our attention.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, I think there are few clauses in the Constitution that reveal more about the founding era than, you know, the idea that representation will include the whole number of free persons and 3/5 of all other persons. I mean, I think, you know, it's clear that the delegates and the authors of the Constitution are going out of their way to exclude the term slavery from the text of the Constitution. Some of them out of, you know, humanitarianism, some of them out of just the sense that you know, that before 1790, the idea that was that maybe the United States would not be, you know, would not retain slavery. You know, it really took off in a way. It took off further in the 1790s, in part as a result of the Constitution. But, you know, I think a lot of people look at that 3/5 and feel like it's a kind of racial coefficient, as one of my advisors, Jack Rakoff, used to say. But, you know, it's the Virginians who want 5/5, and it's the Massachusetts delegates who want 0/5 of slaves. But it's you know, it's impossible not to acknowledge that that fundamental compromise is still baked into the system that we use. I mean, I think, you know, not since the late antebellum period have you heard so many people say that the Electoral College is rooted in slavery and racism. It's not a new argument. I mean, I think it's come up a lot since probably November or December of 2000. You know, the idea that the Electoral College was designed to favor white men in the South, and that it has routinely done that, I think is unmistakable.
All right, well, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions that I think are related. So the history that you described, the initial restrictions on voting suggests that voting is closely linked to taxation, that the right to vote is closely linked to taxation. Does the kind of quasi-universal suffrage we have today reflect a transition away from that linkage? And if so, how did that evolution occur? And I think perhaps in connection with this, I'm wondering if you could also address a kind of apparent return of the poll tax with respect to convicted felons in Florida and perhaps also other states.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can only answer the very first part, and I'm hoping that Kathleen can maybe say a little bit about the more present. I think, you know, you see a shift over the 19th century from property holding to tax paying as one of the qualifications for voting. I think, you know, another, and certainly the idea that you know, you should enfranchise people who are paying taxes. And in fact, you know, you do see in the run-up to the 19th Amendment, many advocates for women's suffrage making the case that women pay a certain proportion of the taxes in the United States and thus deserve the representation. The other aspect here that we haven't really hit on is how often the franchise is extended largely due to military service or to participation domestically within during wars. So, I mean, you could take the Civil War as an example. You could certainly take World War I as an example, and then finally Vietnam with the idea that, you know, if somebody is old enough to serve in the military, they should be old enough to be able to vote. So, you know, that's another sort of running theme throughout the expansion.
Yeah, so I don't know about this poll tax in Florida question, but I'm interested because I assume it has to do with the movements around extending the franchise back to people who've been incarcerated, which is a huge disenfranchised population in the United States. We might also, you know, were we teaching a class about this, it would also be great to have a unit about kind of colonial voting and partial citizenship. As in the case of places like Puerto Rico, where you can vote, but only in particular ways, and then, or DC, frankly, where you have these kind of like bits of partial representation, but you can, I don't know, the Puerto Rico classic example is that you can be drafted into a war waged by a president you couldn't vote for. And I agree that wartime service is a really interesting kind of like, I mean, it's also a path to citizenship in a lot of places, a lot of situations in the United States, but not a protection from deportation as we've seen recently. Or, and I should be careful about using, I'm using that in the slang way. I don't know if that is like a deportation proper or a forced removal or one of the other mechanisms. But I'm interested to learn more about all of that. So if there are people in the audience who know, I mean, tell us in the chat.
Yeah, and in connection with that, you'd mentioned that, you know, felons are a large population that's currently disenfranchised. Can you say more about what other populations are disenfranchised and how large they are?
I am now speaking just as a lay historian. I'm not a specialist in this at all. But I would think incarcerated persons, I would think unhoused persons, I would think about people who, that denizen category includes a lot of undocumented people who live in the United States and have their whole lives in the United States, but can't or won't seek citizenship and a right to vote. A lot of them, by the way, do pay taxes in one way or another. Yeah, how large, I don't know. Yeah.
I think we have time for one
other category I can think of beyond the ones that Kathleen has named are people who move to another state right before the election. Right? that actually does
I
represent.
went to fellowship in New Jersey for 1 year and they are still calling me to jury duty. I'm not going. I don't live there, New Jersey, but they still, I don't know why. Anyway.
So I
That's
think
the opposite of what he was saying, but you get my drift.
we have time for one more question. So this will be the final question. So the questioner writes, it's possible to characterize the Constitution as a defense against democracy, understood by the founders primarily as direct democracy, but by the 1830s, many states had abolished or drastically reduced property requirements, and we have a huge swell in voting, particularly in presidential elections. Would it be correct to describe the long story as sort of the majority works to restrict further extensions to so-called others, rather than absorbing others as an extension of the enlargement of voting privileges that they have benefited from? Or is there an undercurrent of hate that consistently and constantly demands an other, however defined, in your view? And I'd like to start with Kathleen and then turn to Eric.
Oh, yes. Well, I guess my initial reaction to the question is that I think that the founding premise there is tricky because of women, right? We don't have a clear majority up top at the beginning. And there's also a problem with like undercurrent of hate requiring an other is interesting. Eric, why don't you start answering and let me percolate about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really hard question to answer. The questioner already recognizes that democracy is a really pejorative term in the 1780s. It signifies those sort of classical democracies that were subject to demagoguery and were highly unstable. And so, republic comes to be the favored term. And you have people, I have him, the patron saint of voter restriction. This is Elbridge Gerry, or Elbridge Gerry, the patron saint of the gerrymander, who at the Constitutional Convention, and he didn't end up even signing the document. He's one of the non-signers, but he, he worried about an excess of democracy. I had a wonderful research assistant over the summer named Molly Jones, who's a history undergrad. And we did a project together where she really sampled newspapers from every 10 years from 1760 to 1870, looking at the meaning of democracy and how it had shifted and changed as the sort of demographics changed. So it's sort of too early to report on that, but certainly there were some sort of key turning points in the 1820s and the 1830s, and then finally really 1840s to 60s with the sort of cementing of the Democratic Party. But even today, there are states that specify, in their textbooks, a preference for the word democracy over republic, or a preference for the term republic over democracy. And I think you can probably guess what color those states represent on a lot of electoral maps.
I think I would just add that instead of like majority versus other, I think power might be the word we want. I think people in power are interested usually throughout history in maintaining power and putting up fences around that power in various ways, both literal and metaphoric. So and then the other thing I would pull out of the question, just as an interesting way of thinking about the moment that we're in, is that there is this other fundamental tension between the power of the mob, which is sometimes, the good mob and sometimes the bad mob, but the power of the people as a whole and the power of the government. And that big old fight about, is government going to restrain the mob, or is the mob going to restrain the government? And that's part of what militias are getting at. And that's part of what all vigilantes are trying to invoke, is this claim to sovereignty, this claim that I'm here to restrain the government, and I'm here to make this claim on my right to be in charge of you and not the other way around, right? It's the same claim we make when we vote. It's just a question of method and means and ethics, and kind of like the morality of the frame in many ways. But I think that there is this like, that it's, I just feel it still as this unresolved problem in the nation, that there's always going to be that tension, and people really are moved by it in a whole bunch of different ways, and sometimes in unpredictable ways.
Thank you both for that. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions. And now I would like to welcome Dean Ann Robertson back to the virtual podium.
Well, this has been a marvelous discussion. Thank you so much, Kathleen and Eric. I hope you will all join us again this winter for our next Dean's Salon. Our speaker is still to be determined, but I assure you it will be exciting. I'd also like to let you know about the Humanities Division's annual Humanities Day, which will take place a week from Saturday, October 17th. This year, we will celebrate our 40th annual Humanities Day with keynote speaker Martha Nussbaum, who will present on the topic Animals, Expanding the Humanities. You'll also have the opportunity to see Eric speak again, this time in a panel on the topic Reinventing Democracy for the 21st Century. So thank you all for joining us. Keep safe, and I hope to see all of you again soon. Good night.